morning, everyone. Welcome, and how fantastic is it to be back, meeting face-to-face as a national network of chief executives. Welcome back to Nottingham, and welcome back to a bit more normality for all of us. We're not all here, understandably. These things take time, and again, it's just been one of those weeks, hasn't it? But it is really good to see so many of you here today, so welcome. And as we return to a familiar place, and for many of us a long-standing network of colleagues, after such tumultuous times, I wanted to start today with this. There is nothing like returning to a place that remains unchanged to find the ways in which you yourself have altered. I think we'll all be struck a little bit by that today. When we last met face-to-face in this room 2 years ago, who could have known what awaited our world, ourselves as leaders, and indeed, so crucially, our young people? It feels like a lifetime ago, and so much has changed for all of us. I myself have changed. You yourselves will have changed in that time too. Yet what we believe in hasn't changed. Indeed, the last 2 years, I think, have helped us to crystallise some things. I'm reminded of how at the last event we spoke of two really important themes. The potential of Academy Trusts to be at the very heart of their communities, serving communities first and foremost, both loved by them and accountable to them. And the second theme, the role of chief executives as leaders in embodying the change those communities wish to see. Those themes could not have been more pertinent for what was to greet us in 2020. And they remain hugely pertinent as we rebuild and forge ahead together. So today, we will revisit them. COVID-19 has dominated our lives. It dominates our news. It dominates the thinking of governments and school leadership associations and policymakers everywhere. Yes, and I don't mean to downplay this at all, it is part of a much bigger story, particularly for the generation of children and young people you all serve. A generation who simply do not want to be defined as the COVID generation. If theirs is to be a life not defined as such, we quickly need to tap into exactly what it is that they and their parents need and expect from us as leaders and from the organisations that serve them as we emerge from this pandemic. The bandwidth of governments is narrow. Just under 2 weeks ago, we welcomed the 6th Secretary of State for Education in just over 7 years. This is another new person who needs to learn about how the system works, what the key trends and dynamics are, and how to help serve leaders and embed sustainable change. That will take time, and we can't simply sit with the so-called vision of the last Secretary of State that is simply limited to let's get more schools in trusts. It simply lacks sophistication. So I'm not going to play down the potential of the new government team. I'm an optimist, but I don't think we can wait for them to catch up, and I don't think our communities want us to wait either. The fact is, communities are increasingly looking to chief executives and leaders of organisations, more than governments, to identify and address the change they wish to see. They see greater stability, commitment, and consistency in your leadership. Indeed, a few of you have reminded me in the last week or two how your tenures as chief executives have now outlasted 7 education secretaries. So let me share this quote from Edelman's Trust Barometer. The public are looking to CEOs of organisations across a wide range of sectors to fill the void left by government, taking the lead on change, stepping in to address societal issues and holding themselves accountable to the public. 68% said chief executives should step in where government does not fix societal problems. And 66% said CEOs should take a lead on change rather than waiting for government to impose change on them. Meanwhile, according to the OECD, trust in government among young people has declined across the developed world since 2016. Simply spending our time looking upwards, digesting government announcements, guidance and pronouncements is not going to get as far as strategic leaders serving a generation of young people. Important though it is, and it has been important, that's management, not leadership. The Edelman findings are incredibly important and represent everything that Forum Strategy is about as an organisation. We recognise that change in the system and for our young people is driven by the vision, strategy and day-to-day actions of the people in this audience, who inspire and motivate others to deliver, and driven by your boards, of course. That is why we get up in the morning. The challenge is that in the last 18 months, while some leaders have had or made some space to think ahead, to consider the bigger picture and the strategic implications and broader needs of communities, others, often very understandably, have seen their working lives dominated by reacting to the latest government guidance and pronouncements. And who can forget New Year's Eve last year? So how do we recalibrate? How do we get ahead of the curve for this generation and communities they are growing up in? How do we be and create the change they wish to see in the world? Because as we have heard from Saeed, it is their world we are all shaping. As a leader of a strategy organisation, I believe that the very best strategy emerges from great intelligence on the ground. I like to call it contextual wisdom. We are seeing strategic Academy Trust CEOs shifting their focus right now to spend less time looking upwards than they've had to do of late, and more time looking outwards for contextual wisdom and, of course, the capacity to deliver on that. Looking outwards, not simply upwards. And what are they hearing? What does that intelligence and contextual wisdom tell them? What does it tell you? Well, we'll hear much about that today. We do know that parents want to build on the partnerships that came through COVID-19 and to make sure that technological developments and the lessons from remote and online learning is harnessed, ensuring as we do that children are the masters, not the servants of technology, through high quality and safe digital learning. As we will hear from Liz Williams and Professor Paul Howard-Jones later, the shift to an online world for our young people, including the way in which they learn and prepare for their future lives, as well as socialise, is inevitable. It will define their futures, and trusts and schools need to be at the heart of preparing them and equipping them for that. We hear from communities that diversity matters and that the leadership of organisations should better reflect the communities they serve. As things stand until today, we have no real grasp about how well trust leadership models diversity and inclusion in England. Under the leadership of Alice Gregson, Forum's Chief Operating Officer, who we will hear from in a moment, we now understand a little bit more. We hear that people, particularly young people, want the organisations that serve them to be sustainable and greener. 58% of children and young people surveyed said governments were betraying me and/or future generations, while 64% said that their governments are not doing enough to avoid a climate catastrophe. 59% of children and young people surveyed were very or extremely worried about climate change. This summer, Place to Be, a charity offering counselling in schools, said the issue was becoming more and more prominent. The organisation said that climate anxiety was brought about by a sense that politicians and big organisations were not acting quickly enough. And we hear from pupils and staff that a culture that values well-being, flexibility and care above high-stakes accountability really does matter now. It's time to put behind us the high-stakes culture that once existed before the pandemic in some trusts and schools. Whether it's the Good Childhood Index, and we'll hear from Mark Russell, the Children's Society CEO later, or the DFE's own research into staff well-being and retention, the data tells us we cannot afford for mental health and well-being to be collateral for bigger numbers and top-down plaudits. A post-COVID world has to be less high stakes for everyone in the education system, not least teachers and young people. So this is about generating rich and purposeful digital inclusion and learning, equipping young people to be healthy, safe and creative in this new context. It's about striving for diversity and inclusion modelled from the very top of our education system. It's about committing to sustainable and greener estates and practices and responding to the concerns of young people on climate change. They expect the organisations they attend day to day to be leading the way on this. And it's about fostering a culture that prizes well-being, care and employee flexibility. Now, the trust sector has made some leaps on some of these areas. There is very little strategy or plan from government on these issues. It is down to boards and to chief executives, you as chief executives, to model the change communities wish to see, and to, of course, make ourselves accountable to communities for that too. As Campbell McPherson, the author and change management expert, wrote in a recent article for Forum Strategy, as the CEO, we need to lead the way. We need to be resilience personified. For the whole organisation is looking to us for reassurance, honesty, and the confidence to thrive in a changing world. So how are you doing on being safe and purposeful digital natives and setting expectations for healthy and productive use of technology? How are you doing in shaping diverse teams that reflect the communities you serve? How are you doing on modelling a more sustainable, greener approach that young people say matters more than anything else? How are you doing in demonstrating a commitment to your own well-being and flexible working and that of your team? Is your board, and through them your communities, genuinely holding your trust and your leadership to account on this? Now, none of this is easy, but it is about walking the talk as a foundation. And within that lies your power and influence as chief executives. People will watch you, they will want to believe in you, and they will want to be inspired by you. They will also take inconsistency and mixed messages badly. We are increasingly seeing chief executives in all sectors spending more time and energy on these areas. It's not simply education. And the thing about all these areas is that they represent investments. Long-term investments in our people, our estates, our technological capacity, and our reputation as great organisations to belong to and work for. The author of The Outsiders, William Thorndike, often refers to the CEO as the resource allocator in chief. I think the next phase of trust leadership will be defined by how you lead as chief resource allocators, be that your focus, your energy, your time, and how you spend the organisation's money. So are you embodying that commitment? Is your role as a resource allocator in chief reflecting the hopes, concerns, dreams and aspirations of your communities? Is it responding to the contextual wisdom as you gather it? It's a big ask, it's a big leap, and the chief executive role can quickly become a lonely one, of course. But looking up to government and to ministers for ideas and solutions won't help with that. The world is too complex, too fast-paced. But looking outwards to the potential and capacity of your communities, to your strategic partners who you choose wisely, to your staff, but importantly to one another within this network will really help. In fact, you won't get very far without any of that. So we arrive here in Nottingham at a defining moment for our young people, for our communities, for our education system, and for you as leaders. You have come through the crisis with a determination and commitment driven by huge, huge moral purpose, and for that we all thank you. Now I believe is a time for returning to strategic leadership based on contextual wisdom, the reason I'm sure so many of you came into this job. Young people expect that change, and they expect you to rise to the challenge, looking outwards to them and their communities, modelling the commitment to a better world that they all wish to see. This is now an exciting time to be a leader again, an exciting time to be the chief executive of an academy trust again. So today and beyond today, enthuse one another, enthuse your people, and enthuse your young people. It's time for us to move from crisis to the true business of being the CEO, nurturing and growing organisations in the widest possible sense that serve, that enthuse, and that inspire a better world. In the words of Joni Mitchell, we are stardust, we are golden, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Let's together reconnect with the power of strategic leadership and take our place in nurturing a better world and a better future. After all, isn't that why we all get out of bed in the morning? Over to you. Thank you.